Hello, welcome back from lunch. So just to check that you're in the right room, this session is How We Work Now, and the film journalism session is in Cinema 3, so just check you're in the right space. Hopefully someone told you that as you came into the room. And just before we start, just to give a little plug to Duncan Speakman's Only Expansion project, which is the headset tour that you can do. Some of you have done it already, but you'll have time to do that at the end of the day, maybe before you head off. So you just pick up a headset from the reception desk, and that's what I'm going to do at the end of the day. And yeah, before we start the session, we have our last cinema stories from the Genesis Cinema.
Oh my God, you're here and you look beautiful. Coming forward. I am feeling like a coffee, so I'm gonna have one. Hey, hey. Wow. Enjoy. That was amazing. Look at that. How beautiful is that? I know, right? So what are you feeling like? Old movie, new movie? Two tickets for both ones. Hi. That's a book. Excellent. Sweet. Yeah, sweet. So sweet. Oh my God! Oh my God! Thank you. One for luck. Hey! Just joking. I love the cinema. Look at that. I've done it. Wow. I guess the best. I absolutely love it. Whoa! Look at this. That's my favorite film ever. Actually, make me laugh. Let's go. Can I have some pizza, please? You know who Charlie Chaplin is? What? You don't know who Charlie Chaplin is? Come here. This! Charlie Chaplin. How cool is that? He actually acted here when he was 10 years old. Right? It's amazing. Oh, actually, he is the king of the silent cinema. Bobby! Should have Chaplin. That's my favorite, man. I know which you are. Voila. Genesis Cinema. What else would you ask for?
Okay, hi. Welcome everyone. Welcome to our session, How We Work Now. I'm Melanie. I'm the new director of Bird's Eye View. We're just going to ask each of our panel just to introduce themselves very quickly before we get into it. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman with blonde hair, not real blonde, tied up, fringe, black rimmed glasses, wearing all black and put red lipstick on for the occasion. And I'm really happy to be joined by Melanie Hoyes. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone. I am the Industry Inclusion Executive at the BFI. I am a mixed race, brown-skinned woman wearing a grey jumper, and I've also put on red lipstick for the occasion and have curly hair. I'm not bald. I do have curly hair.
And we're also really pleased to be joined by So Mayer, who's joining us virtually. Hi, So. Oh.
Hi, Melanie and Melanie. I'm Somaya. I'm one of the co-founders of Raising Films and the research manager. I am a white Jewish person, currently a giant floating head with salt and pepper hair and glasses. And I'm delighted to be here virtually today.
Thank you. I'm really, really pleased that, that you could both join us. Thank you. And I meant to say, obviously, it's brilliant to be back at this Way Up, and it's great to see you all. And also just want to say hello and to acknowledge those who are joining us virtually. So hello to all of you who are joining us from home. So just to say a bit about kind of our perspective at Bird's Eye View. We are a charity with a mission to champion women and non-binary filmmakers and to build communities around films by women and non-binary filmmakers, and also with a mission to advocate for equity and inclusion in cinema. And one of the things that I kind of believe in passionately as a kind of route to equity and inclusion in our industry is around kind of fairer working practices, and also just simply kind of more compassionate working practices in our sector. So to hear the findings from the Raising Films report that came out only a few weeks ago. The headline of which was that 63% of respondents to the recent survey that Raising Films issued are considering leaving the screen industries, citing stress, is deeply concerning. I mean, it might just evidence everything we already know and which some of us might even feel. But still, it felt like this Way Up creates a kind of timely point for conversation and also intervention. And I'll hand over to So in a minute to talk a bit more about the Raising Films survey and the report. And just to say, we're not expecting that anybody here has read it necessarily. Great if you have and contribute your thoughts. But that's why So is here to talk about it. So please know that there's no expectation that anybody has read it yet. But yeah, I think it's just really important to kind of say from the offset, and sorry, I should say that Raising Films, the survey that went out when the 63% of respondents that I'm talking about are people who have parenting or caring responsibilities, and that's kind of primarily what we're here to talk about, although also the sector more broadly. But I think really important to kind of state from the start that though Raising Films, this survey went out to the sector more broadly in terms of the screen industries, that the findings were kind of as representative of our exhibition sector here as of any other part of our sector. And also, just also to kind of caveat from the beginning from a Bird's Eye View perspective is that, of course, I think what we're going to talk about today, it is a gendered issue in that parenting and caring responsibilities do disproportionately fall on women generally and in our sector. But I think it's really, really important to say that this conversation isn't just about the kind of gendered issue. Like we are talking about people with parenting and caring responsibilities more broadly. So, and for people of all genders. So I wonder if I can hand over to you at this point just to talk a little bit about Raising Films' work and what led to first the survey that you issued and then to the report.
Sure, and thank you for that brilliant introduction. Hello to everyone in the room. My pronouns are they, them, but I think the badge might be back to front for a lot of you, so that's what it's trying to do. Raising Films, as Melanie said, is an organisation for parents and carers, and that can be anyone. we include anyone with caring responsibilities. You may not know that you are going to have caring responsibilities at some point in your life, but it is incredibly and increasingly common. And the last few years have just shown that anyone can become a carer at any point. And it's a very invisible issue in our industry. When we started as a really tiny group of 5 people, volunteers, talking about this in 2015, there had been no look at parents and carers in the British screen sector, and no one was saying, well, maybe one of the reasons that we're asking the question, where are all the women, is that there are hard barriers that prevent those who do the majority of caregiving labour, although, as Mel said, this is something that is done by people of all genders, and it's very important for us that the conversation includes everyone who does caring. But it is a particular gendered barrier to entry into industries that are long hours, low pay, and often particularly have a lot of evening and weekend networking required. And so the background to the survey we did this year is not just COVID. It's the screen industry and how it's working, how it's not working for everyone. But certainly what's happened around COVID has exacerbated and in a lot of ways revealed that, made it clear that how we work now is not working. And it won't work until we recognise that caregiving is labour. It is work. For almost everyone who does it on a daily basis, it's uncompensated. And for the professionals who many of us also depend on and include in our caregiving, it's very poorly compensated. It's invisible labour, it's highly gendered, and Arlie Hochschild had a great term for it, which was the second shift. And for lots of us, especially freelancers, it may even be a third or fourth shift. But there's little recognition, and the screen sector is not alone in this. I want to say that caregiving is work. It's work that has to be done. And there's little support for those who are trying to manage those multiple shifts, or go to a festival on short notice, or when a meeting gets cancelled, or a project deadline gets moved up. And we call this the cascading crisis. It's like dominoes. If one of those short-term events changes, if a payment gets delayed, or an urgent meeting gets cancelled, everything goes down. And over the last 2 years, we've seen that's true for everyone. A big change puts everyone's work on hold. If you have caregiving responsibilities, that means you have additional expenses, you have additional time requirements, and maybe also additional physical and mental health issues due to the stress of managing that. So our report showed that even if you have considerable structural advantages, such as owning your own home, coming from generational wealth, having a salaried senior position, being able-bodied, caregiving responsibilities are still highly challenging. So even if you have all of that advantage, the additional burden of childcare, particularly this year with homeschooling, can become unmanageable because of the lack of recognition that it's work that you do in your paid employment. So for anyone who doesn't have those considerable structural advantages, it's extremely challenging to work in the screen industries. And our survey shows that while there are some employers and organisations, and I'm sure some of you are in the room, who were taking all the care of their employees, they were offering furlough and even some support costs or tech support, recognition of care. We heard a lot of great stories, and we know there are a lot of great schemes out there, but it's not universal. It's still too much of a lottery. And being employed itself is a bit of a lottery, as there are too few jobs. Most of them are in urban hubs, and they're not flexible enough. Twice as many parents as non-parents freelance in the screen sector. That's a huge segment. And while it's more common in production, it's also the case in exhibition. And we support everything you might have heard in DLF for Freelancers panel about a call for a code of conduct, rate cards, and accountability, because freelancers are not even getting the minimal support that employees were getting. Now, one of the things I mentioned was urban hubs. One of the specific cohorts we saw in our survey was that there's a major inequality between those who are able to work in London and the South East, or in Edinburgh and Glasgow for Scotland, and those who are working outside those hubs, not in the film hub sense, hubs small h. And this is a really entangled one. We know that becoming a parent, or sometimes having to move to care for a family member, has a demonstrable link to relocation, often in order to find affordable housing or to provide additional finances to support caring. That might mean also leaving behind a support system and an employment network. So suddenly on top of caregiving labour, freelancing, non-hub locations, and a lowered income can become a vicious cycle of not making ends meet. If you're a single parent, that's exacerbated exponentially. And we found that the uptake of free school meals by single parents doubled between 2020 and 2021. And that sounds like a small detail, but this is really the crux of our survey, because there's not enough recognition in the screen sector of the real socioeconomic situation of its workers. And I can sort of feel from the energy in the room that some of you are nodding and saying, yes, this isn't being talked about enough. There are workers in our industry who are receiving universal credit, free school meals, and childcare vouchers. Now, that not only points to poor pay or a lack of jobs, but also to the fact we need to understand the complexities of what it means to offer freelance contracts and 0 hours contracts to people where the systems for receiving these benefits are so complicated and can be utterly thrown into crisis by a late payment from an employer, or even worse, chunks of payments coming all at once and then not for several months. So our research tallied with the findings of the Spirit Level project that financial stress, when you don't have the generational wealth or resources to cushion it, is the major cause of situational depression and anxiety. So when we're talking about a mental health crisis in the screen sector, we're talking in a very large part about low pay for long hours, unpaid overtime, and a lack of in-work benefits and support. So I'm going to leave it there with the bad news for the moment, but there is good news to come.
Yeah, we'll come on to talking about the kind of recommendations from the report and the kind of takeaways that hopefully we can all, kind of take from the report to, in terms of kind of solutions going forwards. If we can come to you next, Melanie, it would be great to get a bit of kind of context for your work at BFI, and you were one of the commissioners of this report, so if you could maybe tell us a bit about kind of what led you to commission it.
Yeah, sure. So I work in the inclusion team at the BFI. Our role has been largely external over the last few years, so really trying to advocate for better access, equity, inclusion in the industry from a kind of external point of view, advising, bringing people towards the policies that we have internally, and trying to work collaboratively with industry to make things more equitable and better for everybody. My specific background is academic, and so I'm really interested and kind of nerdy around how data and research can inform and sort of give us knowledge about how to put that into practice with policy. So there's no point in kind of creating policy based on assumptions about how things work if that's not going to serve the industry in the way that we want it to. So when Raising Films came to me during the pandemic and were interested in sort of doing this study, and I think we're going to talk about the pandemic again. I'm trying not to say it, but it's just inevitable. But it obviously showed, even though all of these things were in flow before, it really showed the kind of disproportionate effect that a crisis such as that was having on minoritized communities. And caring responsibility in particular, which I think a lot of people found themselves thrown into, which they might not have been. I, for example, have an elderly mother who was perfectly fine, but during a pandemic I had to feed and take food to her, and albeit temporary. But I think people found themselves in those positions. So I was really interested in how we reframe the conversation around being a more inclusive, fairer, nicer industry. Post this kind of point of crisis that has allowed us to reset and potentially hopefully come back in a different way, because we don't have to go back to how things were before. So yeah, when they approached me to help with this research, I was really into it because I just wanted to know what we could be taking forward and what advice we could be taking forward from the people that are kind of at the coalface of this in their daily work. So yeah, it was really important to us to understand that.
Thank you. And we're going to come on to the learnings, but maybe it would just be helpful to get a sense from you in terms of where the BFI are at in developing this new strategy going forwards, and also you're refreshing the diversity standards. So how this report might, and this conversation, in fact, might kind of help inform that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. To start with the diversity standards, they were set up, for anyone that doesn't know, they were set up as a funding requirement to kind of give guidelines about how to have more inclusive practice in your recruitment, in the stories you're telling. So predominantly in production, but there is a sort of audience section, section D, thinking about who you're reaching out to, kind of, how to be better. If you're going to try and be more diverse, more inclusive, more equitable, where do you start? So there are a set of guidelines that are a requirement, a contractual requirement on all of our funds. But they have kind of grown exponentially over the last few years and have been taken on by global sectors, by TV and games. The BAFTA awards have taken them on. So they've sort of mutated in a way that they were set up as this sort of internal policy. So we're in the process of reviewing those. They were set up in 2016 in their current iteration, and it just felt like a probably overdue moment, but a moment to sort of talk to industry and all the different sectors that are using them and find out if they're working for them, and if they're not, and kind of what else we could be doing to make them more useful and kind of better and easier to use. So that we've had a review. We had an external company consultant come in, do huge amounts of consultation with our stakeholders, and they have written a review which will also lead to a kind of rewrite. So we already take into account when we're talking about diversity and inclusion at the BFI, we use the Equality Act as the sort of basis for that, so the protected characteristics that are within that. But also what we're really talking about is any barrier to opportunity in our industry. So that could be socioeconomic. It can include sort of caring responsibilities or the hours that you're able to work, where you're able to travel, location, regions and nations. So we take all of that into account. It feels like this is a point at which a rewrite is necessary, and to think about some of the things that we've learned from the pandemic, including stuff from this report. And then, yes, in terms of we're in the process of kind of doing our 10-year strategy around our funds and our lottery funding and our strategy as a whole. We've had a new CEO. We're kind of in flux as an organisation at the moment, and really trying to sort of plan in the long term. So anything that we're learning from, like as I say, people that are on the ground, our stakeholders, now is the time for that to be fed into those consultations, and to have those conversations about where we might move our practice or our funding or our requirements to better serve those that we're supporting.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think let's move on to talk about some of the recommendations that are made in the report, and I want to soon kind of open this up for kind of wider conversation and also kind of ideas and suggestions of how we might, as a sector and also just simply within our own individual organisations, begin to kind of tackle the kinds of things that I think we all kind of know and feel, but which have been kind of evidenced through the Raising Films report. And also, I guess, just to say, at this point, I'm facilitating this conversation, but I'm also an employer and a contractor, and so I'm facilitating, but also very much also, in listening mode and also wanting to learn from this. So I wonder can we start maybe by talking about flexible working, because that seemed to me to be, from the report, one of the main recommendations. And I guess especially just kind of having gone through what we've gone through, where, on the one hand, kind of working remotely, and so a kind of flexibility around location has been a thing which some organisations have kept on, some haven't. But then the issues that brings around, on the one hand, the good thing about the kind of allowing for a certain flexibility in working hours, but at the same time, the working hours never end because there's no cut-off point. So, yeah, so I don't know if you want to speak to that point a bit.
Sure, and I do really want to just jump in and say thank you so much to Mel for funding not only How We Work Now, but the scoping study that came before it, where we were able to talk in depth to 12 members of our community and really hear their stories, and that led to us designing the survey. Everything that Raising Films does is participant-led. It comes from our community, and that includes the solutions we offer. We're not asking people to reinvent the wheel. We're not looking for some magic bullet or pill that is going to make everything better. We know there's good practice out there, and we know there are people doing it. So what we want to do is exactly what Melanie just said. We also are open. We're listening. We award the Raising Films ribbon to organisations that tell us stories of good practice. And we're always excited to hear them, from a micro-budget short film to a large organisation like BIFA. Part of it is that the practice has to fit your organisation. So yeah, when we say flexible working, as you said, Melanie, that can mean all sorts of things. It can mean anything from job sharing, where a job is flexible enough to allow for 2 people or a team to be hired to undertake it and have some crossover time. And that's worked for the leadership of one of our main political parties. So the resistance to it in the creative and cultural industries is quite bewildering. It can also mean being flexible around hours for all sorts of reasons to do with caregiving responsibilities, location, disability, access, and the pattern of work, and so on. It can mean being flexible in terms of days worked, how people organise their work. What it generally means is what the company or organisation wants it to mean, and not necessarily what the person who's undertaking it needs. And it's hard to organise the work schedules of lots of people to be bespoke. Exhibition is a very time organised and time sensitive practice. Films need to start on time, films come out on certain dates, venues open and close at certain hours. And that can create a sense of panic or a lack of ability to flex. But very often, listening to the people you're working with, the people who are working for you, helps you come to an agreement. So as one of my co-researchers, Dr. Jenny Chamaret, said, what tends to happen is that workers make reasonable adjustments all the time, and organisations don't. So workers themselves are already making reasonable adjustments a lot of the time. They might be moving around when their childcare is, paying for childcare so that they can come in early or come and do a shift at the weekend or come in for a meeting. They may be patching together caregiving support so that they can be there for the organisation or project that they love and care about as well. And they just want that opportunity to say, hey, if I could come in at 11 rather than 10, I'll still do the work. It may mean that I send emails at 10 o'clock at night with the recognition no one has to respond to them till they're at their desk. But my working day is different from other people's, and I just like that to be heard. And so I think thinking about it that way around, that actually people with caregiving responsibilities, people with disabilities, already constantly making adjustments to be in a very regulated world of work, and for organisations just to meet them halfway and really think about, like, what are the specifics of how to make working flexible. It's not a blanket solution or one size fits all. So this conversation is already doing our biggest solution, which is listening and having nuance.
Yeah, I'd love to come back to Dr. Jenny Chamaret, who's one of the researchers for Raising Films. She talked on Raising Films as well as the published written report. You've also published a couple of podcasts. One's reading out the executive summary, and another couple of the podcasts have been conversations around the report. And yeah, just for anybody else like me who absorbs information better, like, orally rather than through reading. I have to say, those podcasts are fantastic. And she talked on one of them, Dr. Jenny Shamarat, about leadership by the most affected and being inspired by disability and transformative justice movements, saying the people who've been through that journey have already survived. So going to that kind of, that idea that you've just said, so of kind of listening and learning from those, like listening to need, really, and kind of that rather than a kind of top-down approach to, what's our organisation's idea of flexible working, but instead kind of asking those who need flexible working what it is that they need and what it is that it means to them, and then at least trying to find a balance from there. Go on.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say also it's the sort of not assuming that people that need reasonable adjustments are going to come to you and ask for them if that policy isn't visible or the sort of culture of the organisation doesn't feel like that's something that you can ask for. And I think sort of, only thinking about, I need to ask because it's very visible that person's going to need reasonable adjustments. They're in a wheelchair, or I understand what their disability is. There's going to be plenty of people, especially when it comes to caring responsibility, where you would have no idea necessarily because, as So says, they will already be adjusting to exist in the organisation as it stands. So I think kind of shifting that responsibility to the organisation or to the employer to assume that somebody may well need some reasonable adjustment, and it might not be that you can afford to do it, or that it might not be possible to do, but sometimes the very act of listening and understanding that there might be a need is sort of enough to kind of hold your employees with care and listen to what that might be. And quite often it's something that you maybe need to do once that benefits everybody, actually, or it's it is something that you can do that would benefit for everybody if you ask them. So I think this sort of kind of changing the responsibility from the person who needs help to ask for it, which can be very difficult to do if those are really difficult circumstances to talk about or disclose, it is really important to think about your role as an employer and kind of understanding that everybody's different and that they might have needs that you may or may not be able to provide, but asking the question.
Yeah. And asking the question of everybody, not just those that
Exactly.
you think might have needs, when that could apply to everybody in different ways. And maybe before we open it up, so could you talk to us a bit about the carers passport and the kind of findings in the report where or the solutions in the report where you're pointing to Carers UK?
Sure. It's a really good moment to say that Raising Films is absolutely not doing this work alone, either thinking about parents or carers or any protected characteristics and historically marginalised communities in the screen sector, in the creative and cultural industries, in work in general. And in the report and on our website, we've got a Dropbox folder where you can access all of the material that we've read. There's digested versions in the report, but also some of these reports that sometimes, go a bit missing or the web page goes down. We've got them all downloaded there from groups like We Shall Not Be Removed, from Creative Access. The former diversity standards are in there as well. So it's something that we're all doing together. And Carers UK is a nationwide organisation representing carers, which they define as people caring for an adult with additional caring needs. So in our work, we also define carers as people caring for a child who has additional caring needs. And we worked with Carers UK to produce a report called We Need to Talk About Caring, a pun I came up with, which has been desperately underappreciated. Thank you. Which was the first look at carers working in the screen sector. And exactly as Mel said, people often struggle to identify themselves as carers. It might be because it's something temporary. It might be because it is gendered and classed. It might be because it is often a very traumatic experience, both for the person caring and being cared for, which often has, tragic and life-changing outcomes. And sometimes just because it's so difficult to define the narrative of what caring is, because it, unlike parenting, which supposedly has this quite regular trajectory, including schooling, university, and so on, and which we've seen this year can be so disrupted and really reveal what the labour of childcare is. Caring is a very uncertain narrative. It can be full on for a week and then nothing for months, or it can be ramped up in demand if someone has an acute illness or is in a critical phase of their illness. So it's very difficult to tell that story to your employers, to your GP, even to your friends. And so one of the things that Carers UK, who are a brilliant organisation, have come up with is called the Carers Passport, which is a document that you as a carer fill in the terms that are meaningful to you, telling the story you want to tell. And you can then share that document, which is in a recognisable format, with your employer, with your GP, with, say, your kids' school, if you also have kids at school, or so on. Any of these kind of organisations or individuals you need to deal with, so you're not constantly feeling the need either to not mention your story because you feel it's disruptive, or to tell it and be re-traumatised by it because what you're dealing with is often, not always, but often upsetting and draining, and often also badly misunderstood, and seen as just a burden or a duty. So it allows people to define themselves in their own terms. We've created some similar single A4 sheets on our website where you can write a description of your experience as a worker, particularly if you're a parent or carer, and identify some of the actions and outcomes that you'd like to see. And it's literally a printout sheet that you can hand to your employer or keep in your wallet to steel yourself up for some of these conversations, or look at as an employer for how you might initiate these conversations in a workplace-wide way. So Carers UK have offered this idea of a passport, not as something that establishes borders, not that sense of passport, but something that hopefully breaks down borders and allows these conversations to be initiated, as Mel says, without the burden being on the person who is already doing the work. And we were very excited to see that, and it seems like something that the screen industries could take up, because we're a, as we often say, a storytelling culture.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I think we've been having really interesting conversations within Bird's Eye View, and it was kind of touched on in the Dial-F for Freelancer session this morning, this importance of creating a culture within the working environment where people can be their whole selves, and where we kind of need to kind of rethink this idea of putting the boundaries around what we deem to be kind of professional. And we've all been kind of looking into each other's homes through Zoom in the last couple of years, and whilst some barriers should remain, I think just this kind of idea of being more open at work about or creating an environment where people feel that they can bring their whole selves to work and be more open about what is going on for them at home, and that importance as an employer of asking simply what people need, and that, as you were saying, well, the importance of us asking the question and not waiting for somebody, for an employee to kind of come to us with that need, in a way that feels uninvited. So I think the idea of this passport is really useful as a kind of tool for that conversation, but doesn't preclude the fact that the employer first kind of needs to ask what the needs are, and then the passport kind of comes into play, this document. So thank you. I wonder if at this point we open it up.
Can I just, before you do that, just to say that the code at the top of the screen is wrong because we have two sessions and it's got mixed up.
Okay.
So the code people need is 1094590. So I'll give you that as well. So it's 1094590. If you have put a question in, then my colleagues next door have sent it back to me. So we asked the photographer to leave the room. That was a comment that came through. So yeah, I'll give you that code.
Okay. Okay. So if we get questions about journalism, then that's
Can't help
from
you.
yeah, no,
Got nothing.
that's from the other session. Okay, sorry. So yeah, so the code is, did you say 10945990? Just to say that everybody can see each other's comments. If you put in a comment or a question, you can see others. So just be mindful that anything that you write, before disclosing names of organisations or individuals, unless you intend to, can be seen. And also just to say, obviously, that we really welcome comments and questions from those of you home as well. So should I give it a minute before, or do we have some in
I
already?
have a question.
Yeah,
Yep.
great. Go for it.
So the question is, if you feel you've pursued the formal channels available to you to make complaints about your treatment without success, what other options are available to you aside from full public disclosure?
If you've gone through the chat, if you've got a grievance and you've gone through the channels, what other
What else can you do?
options are?
So I guess it's very organisation specific, but what's the panel's advice, I guess, on that?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of our kind of grievance policy, and assuming that yours might be the same, then I guess it's a case of going up the chain as far as you can, obviously not knowing how many kind of levels of hierarchy there are within the organisation that you're talking from. And if you don't find resolution within the executive team, then that is what a board is there for. And if in this circumstance you have gone to the board and you've had, still gone to the board and you've had no resolution, then, I mean, that is formally as high as you can take it without taking it to, if it's really serious, the charity commission, if it's a charity, or perhaps it's, before it gets to that point, it's a case of reaching out to partners who you think might be able to help. They might not be sort of liable for the organisation. They might not be able to be in a position to fix it, but they might be in a position to kind of help leverage support, or at least, I don't know if that helps, but do you have anything to say?
We, at Raising Films, we did some research into this and the situation in the screen industries, and I think Mel can probably speak to this a bit more, but certainly when we published Raising Our Game, our report on harassment, exclusion and bullying in screen industries in 2018, we found that one of the problems is that at policy level, at government level, things are just not working. So funding for legal aid has been cut. Tribunal times are really short. You only have 6 months to bring a grievance, which, for example, if you're bringing a grievance about pregnancy dismissal, is a very short amount of time in which to bring a grievance while also having potentially a newborn and potentially no job. ACAS do still exist to provide advice and support, and the industry unions like Equity and BEC2 and Writers Guild do also provide advice and support, but that doesn't cover everyone in our industry. And exhibition sits. Some people in exhibition can be BEC2 members, but not everyone. So in a sense, what we need is an exhibition union that can collectively represent its members and have some leverage to create some shared standards with the agreement and participation of big organisations and big funders, because otherwise it is dependent on what the organisation's policies are, and if you're a freelancer, there may actually not be a policy that covers you. So it's quite piecemeal, and that is frustrating. It's a huge burden of time on the individual, which goes back to the point about this all becomes the individual's responsibility rather than the organisation. And we do have some resources on the website that we do recommend if it is a case of pregnancy discrimination, pregnant then screwed, are an incredible organisation that have lots and lots of legal resources to assist you. But again, it becomes this kind of lottery to do with both the policies and the goodwill of people in an individual organisation. And we'd like to see a bigger structure of accountability that can make good practice happen across our sector, preferably so that these cases don't happen at all.
Yeah, there's definitely a gap that's kind of obvious and has been brought to light with kind of increasing allegations around bullying and harassment in the industry, sort of quite high profile ones, but you know, there are many that aren't high profile and you know, don't get discussed as much. But it's definitely been a conversation, as happens with these things in our industry. When something is high profile, that kind of starts to filter down into like what everybody's doing. You know, there's a moment of like, oh, like we should be doing something about this, and it's definitely identified a gap. So we have policies at the BFI. We kind of, you know, we have bullying and harassment and racism policy, which is essentially law. Like that is the point. Like there is already employment law which applies to us as an industry. It's just that the way our industry runs, and because it is so freelance, that often just doesn't go anywhere, or it doesn't kind of get enforced in the same way. So there has been a lot of talk around and with government around the sort of, you know, a creation of some kind of accountability body, or you know, somewhere else to take that. So but that's kind of in early talks and planning at the moment, but it's definitely a conversation that's happening.
Also, just to say that organisations should also have like whistleblowing policies, and that there are protections out there for whistleblowers should it come to that.
But I guess also just to say the best thing is prevention. So
Yeah.
it's, you know, what would be better than having a bullying policy is to like prevent that happening in the first place. So yeah, so that's why we're kind of interested in inclusive practice and just being nicer, guys.
Yeah.
And there's a question that kind of relates to that about, are there a series of questions that you might recommend asking a team in order to gain information on the breadth of needs and considerations that can be used to create principles or guidelines for the team? So I guess it's just that, where can people get that advice to put all those things in place? Is that just a really good HR manager, or?
In terms of, sorry, I missed the beginning of that. Sorry, what was the question?
They're asking, are there a series of questions you might recommend asking a team in order to gain information on the breadth of needs and considerations that can be used to gain principles or guidelines for your team?
I mean, I think so. There are policies in existence, and so, you know, all of our policies are free to kind of download and use as you would wish. So the stuff around that, I mean, so I don't know the kind of passport questions, whether that's somewhere to start in terms of people's needs, individual needs. But, you know, like I say, that the bullying and harassment guidelines that we have are just sort of a rejig of what exists in law to take as a consideration for your team, but for our sector. So that is stuff that is freely available on our difficult to navigate website, but it is there if you look that up to kind of to download and use as you wish. You know, like everything that we're trying to do is to share. It's not for us to be proprietary around or only use for us. It is for the industry. So it's somewhere to start, I guess, and adapt as you would.
I totally agree with that. Looking for good practice, again, it's not a reinventing the wheel thing. This is a really important question, though, because it's a reminder that part of employment law is you cannot ask people about pregnancy, parenting, or caring at interview. That has to be a discussion after hiring or after contracting. And we know that this has, well, we can argue whether it's conscious or unconscious bias effect in hiring and contracting. So this is something that needs to be thought about when job descriptions are being written or tenders are being written, and when job interview or contracting questions are being written as well, to make sure that positions are being advertised fairly, equally and transparently along all axes of inclusion, and that there are not hostile questions at interview or unconscious or conscious assumptions that are excluding people who do get in the room for interview or whose tenders are being considered from being taken up. So we like to suggest a proactive approach of writing into your job ad or tender that you have a caregiving policy, that you have an equality policy, that you have a staff member who is designated to have a conversation with this about. State your salary clearly. This is something that excludes so many people from applying. It's uncertainty about a salary or a lack of clarity about what a freelance tender is going to be paid. State if you can offer access support, like covering care costs or travel costs. These are things that will attract brilliant employees and freelancers to you who will come in with an attitude of wanting to have those conversations in a proactive way. So there's actually a lot that organizations can do in how you position yourselves on your website, the policies that are available freely to see. And there's a lot of places you can learn from. The BFI policies, CIPD has a lot of information about this, the Trades Union Congress, which has recently started supporting a campaign for flexible working from day one and shared parental leave, is developing not policies but sets of information around this. And we have some good practice examples on our website, and I'm going to give a shout out to Jules Hussey's Scottish BAFTA award-winning production of Guilt, where on set she gave every crew and cast member a card that said "I care for," and just asked everyone to fill it in. It didn't have to be a person. It could be anything in their life that they cared for, and it established an atmosphere of being able to talk about care and, as Melanie said, being a whole person from day one, and led to an award-winning and brilliant production. So the other thing about this is not to think about it as a duty, but to think about this as care that makes your organisation better and stronger, and to use all these brilliant resources that people have been developing as works for your organisation. Not be afraid to try something, discuss it with your employees and freelancers, see if it worked, and try something else, because people will tell you if it worked, rather than thinking about setting a bunch of policies or a bunch of questions that have to work forever and for all time. And it's hard work, but it's good work. Yeah.
There's also a question about if the survey picked up difference between experience of workers in the independent and commercial sectors.
So, did you hear that?
We didn't ask who people's employers were, partially because in trying to keep material anonymised, there aren't that many parents and carers working in the industry, so it could have created challenges around preserving anonymity and building a composite picture. There's definitely a strong difference between salaried employment, particularly salaried employment in urban hubs, and being freelance, part-time contract, and outside those hubs. So I can't, totally determine whether that speaks to working within the commercial sector and working within the independent sector, but we know that the independent sector has fewer resources, often running on shorter timeframes, often without access to some of the things that go with having a very large studio or very large venue, for example. But we also know from organising in the exhibition sector that commercial organisations are outsourcing some of their most precarious workers. So there's often a divide within the commercial sector as well around who is valued and who is given benefits and support and who is undervalued for the important work that they do. So the divide isn't as simple as that, as like where there's lots of resources, things are better, and where there's not. It's more challenging. As I say, we see, small productions, small venues doing absolutely brilliant work that speaks to their situation and their capacity. But we also see small venues that, as we know, are not. So that was not a divide that I can speak to, but I would say that the picture is pretty complex.
Also, I would say that often, from our point of view, we're often supporting independents and smaller companies, and, they have to jump through a lot of hoops for us in terms of, policies that we're asking them to, sign up to and that kind of thing. So actually, I find a lot of the time, even with no resource or less resource, that the independents just do amazing work with what they have, kind of, and all the demands that we have of them to sort of try and do this work. So shout out to the smaller companies doing that.
I'm very conscious of time, so just a couple more things I should share with you.
Right.
So someone has very kindly shared a site called A Manual of Me, which is manualof.me, which has some great working practices, and that's been recommended by someone in the room,
Brilliant.
which is really good. And there was also a call for more information about what the recommendations are of the report. And just that we've been talking about this for a long time, so how do we actually fix it?
Okay. I mean, so is there any other kind of highlights in terms of the kind of solutions that you point to in the report that you could speak to that we haven't sort of talked about already?
We have touched on a lot of them, and there is if you don't want to read the whole report, there is a document called How to Hire, Retain, I think it's called How to Hire and Retain Employees and Freelancers, which is just like 4 pages long, and that has a series of practical actions for positive outcomes, and not all of them will apply to every size or scale of company, not all of them apply in exhibition as well as in production, but they all have at their centre fairness, transparency, as Melanie and Melba said, compassion, understanding and listening. There are some, as I said, strategic recommendations around things like how do you write a job ad, around retention, around looking at the balance of freelancers and employed staff in your organisation to see who is getting those paid full-time roles and what might that be disguising about some policies your organisation needs to introduce. So beginning from those policies, beginning from the principles of fairness, transparency, inclusion and compassion goes a long way to developing the actions that your organisation needs to take. And in terms of seeing the overall industry, we are starting to see that overall action, not just call for action, but actions being taken collectively. And we want to support that and hope that it will continue, because we really, as Mel said, have seen the need, and hopefully it has been a wake-up call, but to show that things can be done differently in terms of things like remote working and working from home, that more still needs to be done. So the actions are there, the solutions are there, it's the will that is needed now.
Yeah, and as you said earlier, so the care, and I would just add to that this, so much of this being about kind of addressing need and not being afraid to ask people what they need and not being afraid to tell people what we need. Yeah. Are we out of time? Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and your questions and your contributions, for being part of this conversation. And huge thanks to So and all of your team at Raising Films, who are just doing incredible work for the parenting and caring community in our sector. Thank you so much. It's such an important piece of work, and I know that there's a kind of community of researchers who have been part of it. Please do go to the Raising Films website. As I say, there's the report, there's the download that you mentioned, that's the kind of practical actions. The report, there's a long form, there's an executive summary, and there's also the podcasts for the kind of conversations around them. Please do follow. And Melanie, thank you so much for your work in commissioning the report. And it's just really exciting to know that the findings from it and also the conversations around it, including the one that we're having today, will kind of feed into the BFI's work going forward. So thank you so much to our panel. Thank you.
Massive sigh.